Amen. So today we'll be covering Genesis 31. If you want to go ahead and turn over there, we'll be in Genesis chapter 31. Next week, Steve Crawford will be teaching Genesis chapter 32 and 33. I'll try to remind you of that before the class is over, but no promises that I'll remember to do that. But Genesis 32 and 33 will be next week. Before we get into Genesis 31 this morning, because we are changing quarters, I wanted to go ahead and get a little bit of a running go at it and kind of refresh everyone's memory on how we get to Genesis 31. So, of course, in Genesis chapter 12, we see the promise from God to Abraham that he would bless his family and that through him all nations of the earth would be blessed. So, obviously, Abraham has the son of promise, Isaac, and Isaac eventually goes and gets married to Rebekah. Now, Rebekah is related to what Bible character that might be mentioned on this slide? Laban is correct. So I will go ahead and take this opportunity to confess something. I grew up in a small congregation in Alabama, and the way that I learned to pronounce Laban was actually Laban. So I'm going to do my best to pronounce it as Laban, but I've already caught myself several times in preparing for this class calling him Laban. So just bear with me and we'll get through it. So Rebekah is related to Laban. She is actually his sister. So it's a brother-sister relationship. And Isaac and Rebekah, of course, have two children. And what were their names? Yes, that's right. That's right. So they have two sons. They're twins. They're Jacob and Esau. And we see Jacob and Esau have some interesting interactions throughout their lives. What were some of the memorable events that happened to Jacob and Esau as they were growing up and as they were adults? What happened between the two of them?
Transfer of birthright.
That's right. So we get this whole interaction where Esau is hungry one day and he sells his birthright for some food. And then we get this other interaction where Jacob actually goes into Isaac disguised as Esau. I was joking with Chanel, it's kind of like what the kids these days call cosplay. And he was disguised as Esau, and Isaac mistakenly gives Jacob the birthright as his eyes are failing and he couldn't see. And how did Esau feel about all of this? Yeah, he wanted to kill Jacob, so not very well. And we see also one chapter over where Jacob has an interaction with Isaac, and Isaac tells Jacob to go get a wife from the family, because what we have seen is Esau has taken wives from the land, and they have not been good with Isaac and Rebekah. So Isaac sends Jacob off to go find a wife. So he returns back to the family, and that family is ultimately our friend Laban. So this is where it really gets interesting when we start getting into how it pertains to Genesis 31. So, of course, Josh and Kevin and DK, they all taught the class last quarter, did a great job. We see Laban is just a very interesting guy, and I'll leave it at that for now. But at first, Jacob shows up on the scene, and he sees Rachel. He wants to marry Rachel, and Laban's like, okay, we've got a deal. Work for me for 7 years, and we'll make that happen. And then we see 7 years elapse, and who does Jacob actually marry when the time comes? Leah, that's right. And Jacob is upset by this, so he talks to Laban, and Laban says, well, the older should be married first. I'll go ahead, I'll give you Rachel as well, but I'm going to need you to work for another 7 years for me. So at this point, Jacob has worked for 14 years for Laban. He's started to have children, his family's growing, and he's ready to go home in chapter 30, like we talked about on Wednesday night. And he goes to Laban, and he's saying he wants to go home. And Laban says, well, I've divined that the reason why Yahweh, God, is blessing me is because you're here with me. And he's like, what will it take to get you to stay? And I can't help but think a little bit of like a car salesman at this point. Like, what will it take to get you in this car to drive it off the lot? And Jacob says, well, if you give me some of the flock, then we can talk. And he doesn't ask for the best. What specific type of animals in the flock does he ask for? That's right, the speckled and the spotted, which would be the kind that Laban wouldn't prefer to have. And Jacob ends up striking this deal with Laban, and Laban promptly turns around and takes all of the existing speckled and spotted animals and moves them 3 days' journey away so that Laban's only working with the pure-looking animals. So Jacob comes up with this plan over the course of 6 years to selectively breed, speckled and spotted from these solid colors. And it's the craziest thing. It's like branches in front of water that the animals look at, and then they perceive, something, and they have speckled animals. The point, I think, of that whole account is just to realize that the only reason why that worked is because God was with Jacob. Because there's no way that, staring at, a certain type of limb before you get water would conceive speckled or spotted animals. But Jacob, over the course of these 20 years at this point, has been extremely blessed. He has a large family. He has all of this livestock that he has with him. And as we enter Genesis 31, this is really where we see Jacob at the end of these 20 years and ready to go home. And this whole time, one of the things that we talked about last quarter was Jacob's faith. Jacob's faith is growing. He's just like us, right? It's not one day you flip a light switch and you have all the faith that you need. Faith is a journey. It happens over our lives. We see Jacob's faith growing as he spends more time and builds his relationship with God. But that really brings us to the events of Genesis 31. So I want to go ahead and I want to read the first 3 verses of Genesis 31 to really set the stage for what we'll see for the rest of the chapter. Beginning in verse 1, "Now Jacob heard that the sons of Laban were saying, 'Jacob has taken all that was our father's, and from what was our father's he has gained all his wealth.' And Jacob saw that Laban did not regard him with favor as before. Then the Lord said to Jacob, 'Return to the land of your fathers and to your kindred, and I will be with you.'" So kind of in this first verse, we see the sons of Laban upset about how Jacob has been blessed. Why would the sons of Laban be upset by this? Exactly, right? Everything that he takes is something they don't get. And we see in a couple verses, we see actually Rachel and Leah connecting these dots as well. Like they're taking the inheritance of their father, right? So the sons of Laban are obviously upset by this. And then we also see Jacob notice that, Laban's looking at him a little bit different now. There's something about it. Laban's not regarding him the same as he did before. So we've got a couple red flags already. And then ultimately, God tells Jacob, "Go ahead and return to the land that you came from, and I will be with you." And I'll open it up for comments and questions here in just a second, but I did want to make one other point. And that point is that oftentimes in our lives, sometimes it's those bad moments, those hard moments where we have the most growth in our faith and that we see God being the most active in our lives. When we think about Jacob's life, when he left Isaac's household, things were not good. Like he left on bad terms. Esau was ready to kill him. Isaac might have still been a little upset that he had given the wrong child the birthright, but that ultimately drove Jacob to leave. And we see here also things at Laban's household are going a little bit south as well, and this is driving him to leave. And just like that in our own lives, sometimes it's those bad times that when we look back on it, we realize that God was with us the most, and that it was those bad times that actually God used as a blessing. So any thoughts or comments on these first 3 verses of Genesis 31? Yes?
Whatever you believe about what's going on in Genesis chapter 30 and the sticks,
Yeah.
I read something about that.
Yeah.
It doesn't. He's being a schemer again. He's trying to basically defraud Laban out of question.
Yeah.
So I mean, he's reverting to some old ways, which I think is kind of the point. His faith is growing. Being blessed by God, not like Job was blessed by God, is not necessarily always a great thing, because it often puts a big target on your back. By the way, I mean, I think one of the things that you're going to learn, we do learn about Jacob is he's kind of a cad in most of the stories that we hear about him. And God works through him anyway, and boy, isn't that good news for us, because sometimes we're a cad as well.
Yeah.
And God is still going to work with us. And we are either going to be a part of his plan willingly, or we are going to be a part of his plan unwillingly. But there's not an option of not being part of his plan.
Yes, and thank you for that point, Kenny. And I think even going back to Hebrews 11, Jacob makes the cut in Hebrews 11 to be in the Hall of Fame of Faith. And that gives me hope, that one day I will be considered faithful as well. If Jacob, with all of his scheming and shenanigans, can be deemed faithful, that maybe I can be deemed faithful as well. Yes?
I think we can't forget that, I mean, if I'm Jacob, I don't like Laban that much.
Yeah.
I mean, he gave me the wrong girl.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
I'm doing the same thing.
Yeah. And I'll bring this up too. I'm Ethan, and I don't like Laban by the end of chapter 31. Like, Laban's, he's scheming a lot. Like, and I make this point later, but I'll go ahead and make it now. Like, what's funny is we see Jacob scheming, right? Well, we also saw Rebekah instructing him on scheming. Who's Rebekah related to? Laban. So you have that whole connection going there. And then ultimately, when you start looking into the lives of Jacob's kids, they're scheming on their part too. And the point I would make there is that oftentimes in our own lives, sometimes there's that thing that we're like, wow, we don't want our friends doing this. In my case, my kids, I don't want my kids doing this thing, but they're going to be better than me. They're going to not have this problem. And I was talking to Chanel, the example I would use here is sometimes I yell. It's not good. But I've heard Chloe start yelling at her sisters. And like, I have to get onto her for that. Like, you can't yell at your sisters, Chloe. That's not okay. But then every time I do it, it's convicting to me, like, hey, I'm the one yelling. So the point there being, like, I think when you look at Jacob's family all around, you start to see this scheming popping up all over the place in this family. And it's a reminder to us that sometimes that sin or that thing that we have in our lives that we don't want to see in our kids or those around us, it still spreads. Yes?
To follow up on Brian's good point about Jacob not being treated very well by Laban, and yet he says there in verse 2, and Jacob noticed that Laban's attitude toward him was not what it had been. So it's, I don't know, that's an odd statement knowing the history of the two. So I guess the treachery was ratcheted up a notch.
Yeah.
Because it was bad in the first place.
Yep. And we'll see, like, Jacob has a laundry list of reasons, of why Laban has treated him unfairly. Changed his wages 10 times. He says that twice in the chapter. There's a lot of ill treatment that has gone on during this time. All right, so with that, we're going to go ahead and move on to verses 4 through 16. We're not going to read these verses, but I titled this just a family meeting. I think the location of this meeting is very interesting. If you look in verse 4, where is Jacob, Rachel, and Leah meeting? They're meeting in a field, that's right. You would think if you were having a nice family conversation, maybe you meet back in the tent, you're just sitting there in your convenience, but they go out of their way to meet in the field. And this could be some supposition on my part, but as we see later in the chapter, Jacob clearly says he is afraid of Laban. And I think that part of the reason they met in this field was to make sure that they could see who was coming. They could make sure that they weren't being overheard, and they could have this discussion out where they could not be watched or overheard. The other point I wanted to make in this section, Jacob goes through and he tells Rachel and Leah what has been going on and also what God has told him, which is to leave, of course. And then I wanted to read verses 14 through 16 of Genesis 31 as well. Then Rachel and Leah answered and said to him, "Is there any portion or inheritance left to us in our father's house? Are we not regarded by him as foreigners? For he has sold us, and he has indeed devoured our money. All the wealth that God has taken away from our father belongs to us and to our children. Now then, whatever God has said to you, do." So a couple points here. I think it's interesting, one, the trust that Rachel and Leah put in Jacob, but more importantly, the trust that Rachel and Leah put in God. We see them specifically saying here, whatever God has said to do, do it. And when I was thinking about this, I was kind of thinking about this in contrast to Ruth and Naomi, where you see Ruth telling Naomi, your God will be my God. But here they are directly correlating God being responsible for all the blessings that they have seen. And I thought that was very interesting. But any thoughts or comments on these verses 4 through 16, before we move on? All right. So, beginning in verse 17, I do want to read this. Beginning in verse 17, we'll read through 17 through 24. So Jacob arose and set his sons and wives on camels. He drove away all his livestock, all his property that he had gained, the livestock in his possession that he had acquired in Paddan Aram, to go to the land of Canaan to his father Isaac. Laban had gone to shear his sheep, and Rachel stole her father's household gods. Just casually dropping that there. And Jacob tricked Laban the Aramean by not telling him that he intended to flee. He fled with all that he had and arose and crossed the Euphrates and set his face towards the hill country of Gilead. When it was told Laban on the third day that Jacob had fled, he took his kinsmen with him and pursued him for 7 days and followed close after him into the hill country of Gilead. But God came to Laban the Aramean in a dream by night and said to him, "Be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad." So how does Jacob leave Laban at this time? Does he talk to Laban and say, "Hey, we've had a good run, but I'm leaving"? What does he do? He does. And he takes all of his things with him. And on first glance, you might look at that and think, well, why would he do that? But we see in the discussion that Laban and Jacob are going to have later on, Jacob was very concerned that Laban was going to try to take back everything that Jacob had worked for the 20 years that he had been there. I find that whole exchange just very interesting. We do see as well that Rachel stole the family gods or the family idols. And first, that didn't come up during the family meeting, right? This is just something Rachel seems to do. And there's a lot of rampant speculation about why Rachel did this, right? So I'm going to give you the top 3 reasons I read, but I will specify very clearly the Bible does not say why she did it. The first reason I read was maybe Rachel herself worshipped these gods. I find that a little hard to follow given the response that Rachel and Leah gave in the verses we looked at previously, but that was something that I read. Another reason was simply to spite her dad because things had been pretty bad with Laban at this time. Maybe she took them just to get back at him. Another reason that I read that is perceived more as Jewish tradition is that she took the idols so that Laban would not be practicing idolatrous worship. So there's 3 reasons potentially why she took them. It doesn't change the fact that she took them, and that's not good. There's also different translations for the word tricked in verse 20. Does anyone's Bible have a different translation for the word tricked in verse 20? Deceived. That's right. So we're back to Jacob and his old ways, a little sleight of hand, a little trick here and there. In my ESV, there's actually a footnote next to tricked, and it says that Jacob stole the heart of Laban. So exchanging that tricked word for stole the heart. And the understanding that I gained about that was they believed the heart was kind of the center of consciousness. So when it says that he stole the heart, he was basically just stealing away the consciousness from Laban that he had left. So I thought that was also something interesting to consider there. But Jacob's back up to his trickery a little bit. And then I also wanted to point out verse 24, and then I'll open it up to questions and comments. But in verse 24, we see God coming to Laban again in a dream by night and saying, "Be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad." And I say again there because if you were to go over to Genesis 24, verses 50 through 51, I do want to read that. Genesis 24, 50 through 51. This is when Rebekah is being prepared to be given over to Isaac for marriage. Then Laban and Bethuel answered and said, "The thing has come from the Lord. We cannot speak to you, bad or good. Behold, Rebekah is before you. Take her and go, and let her be the wife of your master's son, as the Lord has spoken." So I find it interesting that at the start, at our first introduction with Laban, we see this language of do not speak bad or good. At the end of the story of Laban, we also see this same intervention, this same turn of phrase, do not speak bad or good. Any thoughts or comments on this section before we move on? Yes?
We can see Jesus throughout the scriptures, especially here when you think of Luke chapter 12, starting in verse 13, where one from the crowd came and said, "Jesus, tell my brothers to divide his inheritance with me." And he said, "Man, who made me an arbitrator over you? Beware of covetousness." And here we see with inheritance and everything how these problems can exist and see throughout the scripture.
Yeah. We get really bogged down on our earthly wealth and earthly things. Yes?
You and I talked about this earlier. Starting in chapter 28, Bethuel, the father of Laban, and Laban are called the Syrians.
Mm-hmm.
In 28, 30, 31, here twice in 31. Rachel is never called a Syrian. And I don't know if it's God is setting up his people to understand that Syrians are deceptive like Hazael and Ben-Hadad later in their history. But to me it's significant that he labels these two away from the lineage of the land of Canaan and of the lineage of Christ, that they are different. They are Syrians. They are not
Yeah,
of the family of Abraham.
that's a good point. Any other thoughts or comments? All right, we're going to move on. So on the map here, you can kind of see, it's really probably very small behind me if I had to guess. It's bigger than I thought. Top right, you see 2 from Haran. That's where Jacob would have been starting, where Laban was. You see all the way down to the hill country of Gilead. Some of the sources I read said that's as far as like a 300-mile journey. Remember, Jacob had a 3-day head start, and Laban pursued for 7 days. So that means Jacob's on the road for 10 days trying to get away from Laban. And I can only imagine, you go to bed thinking you're good 10 days later, and you wake up and you're looking up on the hills, and you see Laban's tents, and you're just like, wow, really? And I think it's very safe to say Jacob felt that way with these verses that we're going to read right now. So let's read Genesis 31, 25 through 35. Genesis 31, 25 through 35. And Laban overtook Jacob. Now Jacob had pitched his tent in the hill country, and Laban with his kinsmen pitched tents in the hill country of Gilead. And Laban said to Jacob, "What have you done that you have tricked me and driven away my daughters like captives of the sword? Why did you flee secretly and trick me, and did not tell me, so that I might have sent you away with mirth and songs, with tambourine and lyre? And why did you not permit me to kiss my sons and my daughters farewell? Now you have done foolishly. It is in my power to do you harm. But the God of your father spoke to me last night, saying, Be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad. And now you have gone away because you longed greatly for your father's house. But why did you steal my gods?" Jacob answered and said to Laban, "Because I was afraid, for I thought you would take your daughters from me by force. Anyone with whom you find your God shall not live. In the presence of our kinsmen, point out what I have that is yours, and take it." Now Jacob did not know that Rachel had stolen them. So Laban went into Jacob's tent, and into Leah's tent, and into the tent of the 2 female servants, but he did not find them. And he went out of Leah's tent and entered Rachel's. Now Rachel had taken the household gods and put them in the camel's saddle and sat on them. Laban felt all about the tent, but did not find them. And she said to her father, "Let not my lord be angry that I cannot rise before you, for the way of women is upon me." So he searched, but did not find the household gods. So how would you characterize Laban's speech in these verses? How is Laban approaching this situation? Do you think he's being honest about his intentions, or do you think he's being maybe kind of playing to the situation a little bit? What is your perception of this? Yes?
The key phrase that he uses in verse 29, "I can do you great harm," or "it's with my power to do you great harm," truly reveals his inner motive. I don't think he's being honest about this personally.
Yeah, when I was thinking about this, I was thinking, if you're having a conversation with someone, maybe you're confronting someone about something they've done, you generally don't have that conversation and go, hey, you've done this great wrong, and I could bust your kneecaps, but I'm not going to. Usually if someone's bringing up violence in the course of a conversation, that's a red flag about their true intentions, and I picked up on that as well. It's very odd that he would just drop that in there and be like, I could hurt you if I wanted to. So I do think my perception of this is Laban's intentions are bad. The text later on that we'll read in a minute, Jacob believes that Laban's intentions were bad, that he was going to try to take everything back is what Jacob believed. So that's what we see in verse 31. He specifically says that. So even though Laban's saying, hey, I would have sent you off with song, I would have done all these great things, I don't really think he would have done that, and Jacob doesn't believe that either. We also see the stolen idols come back up. So Laban really wants the idols back. So Jacob, not knowing that Rachel had taken them, actually says, hey, go look through the stuff. And while you're there, look for anything else that I might have taken that belonged to you. And so he goes through and he looks through everything. And this is really where I was going to make the point about deception that we've already made. But Rachel, whether she was having this situation or not, conceals the idols and practices deception by basically implying that she didn't steal the idols. I think that this is just a really interesting exchange between Laban and Jacob, or Laban and Jacob. Knew it was coming again. Any thoughts or questions on this before we move on?
From what I gather,
Yes.
brother, he had a right to be afraid. Verse 43, it says, Laban said, the women, these women and these daughters, these children are mine. These flocks that you have are mine. So Jacob left quietly because he did not want, he knew that his father-in-law wanted to take back his daughters, take back his grandchildren, take
Yeah.
his flocks. And under force, violence, whatever means possible, so that's why it was very strategic in leaving.
That's right. And I think that's a very good point. And the other thing you'll see too is when we get down there, there's another mention when they make the covenant, they make the rock pile to signify that covenant. And then there's a statement where Laban's like, so, we'll just make this rock pile here, and I'm paraphrasing, obviously, but we'll make this rock pile here, and neither of us will cross on either side of this rock pile to do harm to the other. And it's like, I don't know what kind of family relationships you guys have, but I'm not worried that my in-laws are going to do harm to me. You know what I mean? How crazy would that be? To have a situation where you're worried that your in-laws are physically going to hurt you and take back the things that you've had an agreement on and the things you worked for. It's a really bad situation. Any other thoughts or comments? Yes.
It's the rash vow that he makes that whoever you find the gods with, kill them.
Yeah.
And it reminds me of Jephthah in Judges 11, where he says, Lord, if you deliver me from the Ammonites, whatever comes out of my house, I'll offer as a burnt offering. And guess what? It's his daughter.
Yeah. That's a good point. Aaron.
Yeah, it's definitely like a fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, because he's been burned so many times.
Yeah.
So I think it is interesting that, the way that Laban, like you said, I would have sang to you and played all these songs.
Yeah.
It's just the deception continuing.
Yeah.
But yeah, he did it because of how many times you've been burned before.
Yeah. And, there are a couple lessons to us today in here as well. Obviously, don't make foolish promises being a big one. Another one there being be people of our word. If we say we're going to do something, do it. If we say we're going to give someone something for their hard work, make sure you own up on that. So yeah, once again, I don't think Laban's a great guy, but that's just me. So let's see what Jacob thought of Laban. Let's look at verses 36 through 42. Then Jacob became angry and berated Laban. Jacob said to Laban, "What is my offense? What is my sin that you have hotly pursued me? For you have felt through all my goods. What have you found of all your household goods? Set it here before my kinsmen and your kinsmen, that they may decide between us two. These 20 years I have been with you. Your ewes and your female goats have not miscarried, and I have not eaten the rams of your flocks. What was torn by wild beasts I did not bring to you. I bore the loss of it myself. From my hand you required it, whether stolen by day or stolen by night. There I was, by day the heat consumed me, and the cold by night, and my sleep fled from my eyes. These 20 years I have been in your house. I have served you 14 years for your daughters, and 6 years for your flocks, and you have changed my wages 10 times. If the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac had not been on my side, surely now you would have seen me away empty-handed. God saw my affliction and the labor of my hands, and rebuked you last night." So I think here in these verses, we get some of the 20, sometimes when you have a job, you might think, I cannot believe they're making me do this, and you think all of these things like on the course of the job, and then maybe if you have an exit interview, you might say some of those things. It's almost like over the 20 years out in the field with the animals, Jacob had some thoughts. He had some things that he felt, and he's using this as an opportunity to get it off his chest. But from what Jacob's saying, he definitely has a strong case. He's dealt honestly with Laban this whole time. If anything had ever gone wrong with the flocks, Jacob took responsibility for it. And then even at the end of it, they had entered agreement after agreement for the daughters and for the flocks. And Laban's conveniently not remembering those agreements. Laban's conveniently not honoring those agreements. And what I think is really interesting here as well is we see in verse 42b, where, and really in the entirety of verse 42, where Jacob appears to be connecting the dots, that if it was not for Yahweh, if it was not for God, that he would have been sent away empty-handed. And that the reason why God talked to Laban that night and told him not to say good or bad is because he saw everything that Jacob had to put up with, and he was using that as a ruling in favor of Jacob. Any thoughts or comments on these verses before we move on? Yes.
One of the things that I would say is Laban has now had two direct revelations from God, and that is to change his mind about God.
Yep.
By the way, I think one of the things that happens is that the miracles were never very good at convincing people of anything, especially when people aren't set in their ways. The folks do very little prayer. The other thing that I would say is, and this is kind of the applications to today, they're fighting over stuff.
Yeah.
They're fighting over money. They're fighting over flocks. They're fighting over, and at the end of this, basically they're going to come up with a truce that basically says, if you ever come back here, good luck.
Yeah.
And so that's, I guess, one of the things that we all know from personal experience. This is a dysfunctional family because they never learned to live with one another, and they never learned to love one another.
Yeah.
This is a family where they're going to fight over inheritances. They're going to go 50 rounds over plates.
Yeah. And I think the lesson there for us today is don't be like that. Like, don't treat your family like that. And, that can be hard if you value stuff. And to go into personal story time, I've seen that happen in my own family where certain family members were really set on getting their way on things, really set on getting those plates. I think in that particular case, it was a certain figure. But they're really set on getting that, and it ends up sacrificing the relationship because of it. And that's really bad.
There's a great lesson here for us, too. I think in Jacob's character shines through here in the sense that he always seems to he makes a habit of doing more than what's expected of him. I mean, I don't know about you, Ethan, but if I'm going through this situation that Jacob went through, I would quit a long time ago with how I've been tricked and how I've been deceived. I would have given up. And he kept going, and he kept going and doing more than what was expected or more than what was asked of him.
Yeah. And I've even thought about it too, like if I was Jacob in this case and I was being treated poorly by Laban, but I had entered the agreement, maybe I'm starting to eat rams from Laban's flock. I only get the speckled and spotted, so maybe I'm going to eat one of the solid ones, something like that. But he doesn't do that. And he very clearly makes the point here. He's tried to be honorable in all of these things, and still Laban's treating him this way. Anything else? Yes.
Showing the importance of honesty and how detrimental dishonesty and deception can be to every relationship in a family, in a church, and everything. And
Yeah.
those their relationship started out with dishonesty, and it just kind of grew. And even Jacob and Esau in the beginning started out with dishonesty.
Yeah.
And I think the importance that we see in the Bible that God puts on truth and not lying and those things. And I think in our own lives sometimes we don't do that. We may not see the effects of a little white lie or some little deception right away, and so we don't see
Yeah.
it as being as bad as God talks about it in the Bible.
Yep. All right, we're going to move on. Yes, go ahead.
What everybody's saying about, it seems like Laban, his life is trying to deceive people.
Mm-hmm.
Because Jacob is being blessed by God, he thinks that he must be deceiving me.
Yeah.
And usually, and I'm sure everybody here has been in relationships or known people that accuse you of things they're doing. And this seems like that's what's happening with Laban. He's looking at Jacob and going, man, he's got to be deceiving me somehow.
Yeah, there's got to be something I'm missing, that it's just a bad situation. And I bring up this picture too, going back to it. I kind of like these. They're like little courtroom drawings kind of going on here. But I really like how Jacob's so worked up in this little rendering, and then Laban's just like, I don't care. And that's kind of the vibe I think we get from the next few verses, is that even after all this, as was mentioned earlier, he's like, it's all mine anyway. Like, these flocks are my flocks. These kids are my kids. Let's go ahead and read verses 43 through 55 of Genesis 31. Then Laban answered and said to Jacob, the daughters are my daughters. The flocks are the children are my children. The flocks are my flocks. And all that you see is mine. But what can I do this day for these my daughters, or for their children whom they have borne? Come now, let us make a covenant, you and I, and let it be a witness between you and me. So Jacob took a stone and set it up as a pillar. And Jacob said to his kinsmen, gather stones. And they took stones and made a heap, and they ate there by the heap. Laban called it something. That's a really big name. Jagar Shadutha, but Jacob called it Gilead. I like that better. Laban said, this heap is a witness between you and me today. Therefore he named it Gilead and Mizpah. For he said, the Lord watch between you and me when we are out of one another's sight. If you oppress my daughters, or if you take wives besides my daughters, although no one is with us, see, God is witness between you and me. Then Laban said to Jacob, see this heap and the pillar which I have set between you and me. This heap is a witness, and the pillar is a witness, that I will not pass over this heap to you, and you will not pass over this heap and this pillar to me to do harm. The God of Abraham and the God of Nahor, the God of their father, judge between us. So Jacob swore by the fear of his father Isaac, and Jacob offered a sacrifice in the hill country and called his kinsmen to eat bread. They ate bread and spent the night in the hill country. Early in the morning, Laban arose and kissed his grandchildren and his daughters and blessed them. Then Laban departed and returned home. Going back to verse 43, sometimes I trade Pokemon cards with Ethan Krill. Now, I'm a 33-year-old man, I trade Pokemon cards. But if Ethan Krill ever came up to me and he was like, hey, that card that, I just traded you, that's still mine, and I want it back, it's mine. No, like, we made a bargain, we made a trade. That's how that works, Not that Ethan Krill would do that. I'm not saying that. But this is kind of what I perceive the situation to be between Laban and Jacob, that they've made this agreement, 7 years of service for this, 6 years of service for that, but yet Laban is still wanting to go back on that and say that it's all his. And at the end, he's like, well, what can I do, to kind of set this in stone and make sure that we're not going to have hard feelings? Oh, I know, we're going to make a covenant. So that's when they start to make the covenant. They make the pile of rocks at the place I can't pronounce, and Gilead. Once again, I like that name better. And they enter into this covenant that if one side passes the other side to do harm, that's a breach of the covenant, essentially. Any thoughts or questions on this so far? Yes?
Well, it's encouraging, right, I think. So back in those days, when you made an agreement, there usually had to be a third party to say, yes, this is a good agreement. And it's encouraging to me that in this case, both of these men who have been at odds with each other are looking to God to be that third party to bless this agreement and this covenant.
Yeah. That's a good point. Any other thoughts or questions? Yes?
I find it interesting that he's willing to get into a covenant with him. Where's the trust?
Yeah, I know. And it's interesting, too, that Laban, at least the way I read it, it seems like Laban is wanting to enter this covenant by Yahweh. I could be missing something. And it's like, it seems like Laban practiced idolatrous worship as well. So I don't quite know how all that lines up. Like, Laban's just an interesting guy. There's really no other way to put it. Yes?
Piggybacking off of their comments, I think this is a cool story showing at the end of the day God is judge.
Yeah.
And we're both learning that because as deceivers, they think they're right and they think they can get what they want. I think it's interesting why did God tell Laban don't say good or bad? Like why wouldn't he say just don't hurt him or he's my chosen one? I think how worse would the situation be if Laban took matters into his own hands and acted as judge? Because he felt like he was right, whereas Jacob felt like he was right, but in reality, like, Rebecca took the idol.
Yeah.
Like, it's just very convoluted. But at the end, they came to the conclusion that may God be judge between us. I think what wonderful application for us to recognize that we're all imperfect, and we may think we're right. In some situations, we may be right, but at the end of the day, God is judge over us.
Yeah.
We need to show patience
It's a very good point. Yes?
I think it's interesting that Laban identifies God as the God of Abraham, the God of Nahor, and the God of their father, and Jacob identifies him as the fear of my father Isaac. Neither one of them
Yep.
say my God.
That's right. It's not Thomas with Jesus, my Lord and my God, when he sees him again after the crucifixion. It seems very removed. It's very strange. Any other comments? I see a couple hands over here. Hopefully I didn't miss anybody. I'm sorry if I did.
I think one of the things that, I think this is still an easy piece. I think the other thing, at the end of chapter 30, Jacob is doing this thing with the
Animals. Yeah.
I think the point of that story is, out of 20 years, basically, there are about 3 or 4 stories about Jacob and I think that story is supposed to be representative of it. I don't think he has been as faithful a servant as he wants to portray himself.
Mm.
Nor do I think that Laban has been all that great a father. I think they have basically not been great to one another. I think the other thing that I would say is, by the way, I mean, at the end of all of this, Jacob is going to meet Pharaoh. And Pharaoh's going to ask you, how old are you? Man, you're 130, and my days will be short and miserable.
Yeah.
I think that's about right. I think he has made sure that his days are miserable.
Yeah.
And I think, again, that doesn't mean that he hasn't been blessed by God. But again, that idea of blessing, boy, I tell you what, sometimes a blessing can be very difficult. And again, there's nothing stopping either one of these. I think the reason they go to God is because they have now both directly heard from God, telling them exactly what to do. And they have both are saying at this point, you know what? If this is what he wants us to do, he better be the one that makes sure that everything gets done. So I think that they're putting it in God's court, which it always has been.
Yeah.
But I think that's also a threat. I think it's a threat that they're giving one another.
Yeah. Yes.
That leads perfectly with verse 49. I think to every house I've walked into, seen this quote beautifully put across the walls and on some fancy wood panels and cursive and just, no, I never have a heart to tell them.
Yeah. Do you know the context?
It means basically, if I see you again, I'm going to kill you.
Yeah. Yeah. And what?
It's one of those examples of taking verses out of context and not truly appreciating the full picture of what we're reading.
Yeah. That's a very good point. Any other comments? Yes.
I think one of the slightly different take on Laban is that I think in a lot of his interactions he's operating out of fear.
Mm.
You know, he was scared to lose his family. He was scared to lose his stuff.
Yeah.
You know, and on the flip side, you know, when Jacob chooses the black and spotted sheep, those are not the choice animals.
Yeah.
So he had to have faith that God was going to bless him with the inferior flock. You know, when he made that choice, and then with this covenant, you know, it's possible that Laban is appealing to God because that gives him leverage over Jacob. He knows that God may mean more to Jacob than he does to him.
Yeah. It's a very good point. Yeah, Laban definitely seems like a master manipulator. Hopefully I'm not reading too much into that, but I could see him being afraid of losing things and also trying to get in Jacob's good graces at the end as well. All right. Thank you guys very much. We did it. 32, 33 for next week.